In case you are not seeing the slides or are experiencing technical difficulties, I want to ask you whether you can access the meeting again through a new window. So copy paste the link that you received into your web browser, which should preferably be Google Chrome or Edge. For other technical issues, you can email my colleague Jan Verstraeten. I will post his email address in the chat box. So enjoy the webinar. I'll pass on the floor to Lars Muller, Policy Officer of DG Environment, European Commission.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to see this continuing interest in the work that we are doing here in the European Commission, DG Environment, and the Business Biodiversity Platform. You know, since May, we have the biodiversity strategy in place, which we are striving to implement now. And one of the key aspects there is how to better integrate biodiversity into decision-making, public and corporate decision-making. The platform is working since a couple of years with first movers and with piloting enterprises and companies. And we are now in a phase where we really want to roll this out to broader parts of the community and find more mainstreaming partners for the methodologies. But of course, we need to understand which of these methodologies, how to measure the impact and the dependency of on biodiversity by companies is most useful and most informative for the decision making of companies. And that is this series of webinars about understanding better and finding better methodologies for integrating biodiversity into the corporate decision making. With that, I hand over to Johan.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Lars. Good afternoon, all, on this second webinar on biodiversity measurement approaches and with the focus on case studies. So maybe for the people who are less aware about our activities, but already in 2018 and 19, we have developed assessment reports covering about 10 to 12 biodiversity measurement approaches that can be used by businesses and financial institutions. So these measurement approaches are not checklists, but they are relying on quantitative indicators and provide information on significance of impacts on biodiversity. They are also not case specific. So far we have only assessed generic methodologies. Now, until 2019, these assessments have been based on information from the tool developers themselves. And so we were relying, let's say, rather on the methodological underpinnings of the methodologies. While now, from this year on, we are really also focusing on case studies, and we will start with assessing concrete case studies. And of course, this webinar series is an excellent opportunity to introduce this new phase. And something else I want to mention here is that I mentioned here 10 to 12 different biodiversity measurement approaches, but in fact there are more. So we are now identifying even more different approaches. But the risk is that it all becomes quite confusing for businesses for selecting the right tool for their specific business applications. So next slide, please. So we did last year a first initial mapping of these different approaches according to two entrances. The first one is the type of business application that you want to support with the biodiversity measurement tool. And the second one is the organizational focus area, meaning, is it product level, is it site level, is it more for the supply chain, or corporate, or even a portfolio or a sector, when talking about the financial institutions perspective, for instance. So this was only very preliminary. We have already now a quite good idea, but we hope that with more case study descriptions and assessments that we will be able to refine these decision framework on the short term. So this for introduction now, what I want to add is that for the case study descriptions, we are collecting from now on case study descriptions. We use a uniform template. So we have developed a uniform template for that. We will finalize it next week. We have also established a quality review panel of independent experts who will jointly assess the different case studies and give an independent opinion, always in a very positive way of formulating it. But and we will all collect them on the platform's website. So taking a look from time to time to the website is very useful also from that perspective. This by way of introduction. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to the first presenter of this afternoon, which is Cath Tayleur from Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership, and she will give a presentation on the Biodiversity Impact Metric. Kate, over to you, please.
Hi, thanks, Johan. So yes, I'm Cath Tayleur. I'm from the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. We're part of the university, but we work very closely with business to develop leadership and solutions for a sustainable economy. And I sit within our business and nature team, which of course has a particular focus on nature and biodiversity. Next slide. Sorry, can you go back one? So as we know from this webinar series, there are a number of approaches and methodologies for measuring business impacts on biodiversity. But sort of 4 or 5 years ago, this was not the case, which led our Natural Capital Impact Group, which is a coalition of sustainability-focused companies convened by CISL, to work on this challenge collaboratively. So we wanted to know if we could find an approach for measuring the impacts for supply chain companies on biodiversity. Next slide. So the challenge, as I'm sure you're all aware, with measuring your biodiversity impact is that biodiversity is context dependent. So what that means is that a ton of soy will have a different impact if it's produced in Brazil versus the US. So it's really important to know where you're sourcing from. However, we know with many supply chain companies that they have long, complex supply chains. They might operate over many thousands of sites, and they might shift their sourcing from year to year. Next slide. So while some progress is being made with traceability of complex supply chains, we're still some way off many companies knowing exactly where all their raw material production is occurring. And this is important because this is where the greatest impacts on biodiversity are going to occur. So what we wanted to do was create a method that filled in the gaps of companies' knowledge using credible data and assumptions. Next. Next slide. So what we did was we created the Biodiversity Impact Metric. So the idea of this approach was that it would allow companies to measure the impact from agricultural supply chains, help them identify high-risk locations, inform the development of their strategies, goals and targets, and help them align with global goals for nature. Most importantly, our approach is very simple. So it requires a company only to know the quantity of what it is buying and the country it is coming from. And so as I talk through the detail of all of this, just to let you know, this is all published in a report which is available on our website. Next. Next slide, thanks. So the Biodiversity Impact Metric has 3 components. The first is land area. So what is the footprint of your production? How many hectares are required to produce the amount of raw material that you're purchasing? The second component is quantity impacted. How intense is that production? And how has this impacted the biodiversity that would have once occupied that area? And then finally, biodiversity importance. So how important is this biodiversity on a global scale? Are you operating in an area with particularly rare or threatened species? Next slide. So as I talk you through these components in more detail, I'm going to use a hypothetical example to start with of the Big Green Fashion Company. So this company sources cotton from Brazil, China, India, Pakistan, and the US. But they don't know where within the country they're sourcing from, but they do want to know whether they might be having an impact on biodiversity. Next slide. So for the first component, land area. So some companies might be able to provide precise data on the actual land area used for commodity production. But in most cases, companies won't have this information. So what we do instead is we take the quantity that they're purchasing, so sort of the tonnage, in combination with the source location, ideally at least to a country level, if not more accurate. And then we combine this with yield data. So that again is either actual yield data that they've got from their suppliers, but when this isn't available, we can fill this in using country level estimates. So if you just go back for a second, the big green fashion company, we know, for example, they're buying 10,000 tons of cotton from each country. They don't know the yields that their farmers have. So in this instance, we calculate land area using tonnage in combination with yields from the FAO database. Next slide. So for the second component, the quantity of biodiversity impacted, we use something called mean species abundance values. And I think the next two speakers are going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, but essentially it comes from a global model which looks at what proportion of biodiversity is left in different land use types and intensities. So what we do is we have a questionnaire which asks the companies about the production practices to determine land use and intensity. But quite often the case is companies won't have this information about exactly what's going on in the ground, so we take a precautionary approach and assume that the production is intense. So it's sort of a worst case scenario. So in the instance of the big green fashion company, they know they're buying organic cotton from India and the rest of their cotton is conventional. So in this case, the land intensity for the arable production system is moderate for India and intense for everywhere else, which means that in India, we have about 30% of the original biodiversity left and elsewhere 10%. Next slide. And finally, we have our biodiversity importance variable. So for this, we use something called range rarity, which is a combination of the number of species and the size of their ranges. So the idea is that on this map here, the areas that are in red either contain a high number of species and or those that are occupying a small area. So the idea is that this measure of biodiversity can help reflect the risk a company might have of driving a species out of to a local extinction. But often again, we don't know where within a country a company is sourcing from. So what we use is subnational production information to weight our answer to those regions that produce more of a commodity of interest. So for example, the big green fashion company doesn't know where within a country they're sourcing from, but we can start to narrow that down by focusing on those areas which we know produce cotton. Next slide. And so here is an example of the kind of results that we have when we have traceability to the country level. So this map here shows the total impact in weighted hectares. So that's the number of hectares the company is influencing, weighted by biodiversity impact. So this map shows that the big green fashion company's cotton sourcing has the greatest impacts in India and the US. Next slide. We can also look at this on a per ton basis. And this allows us to compare across sourcing locations and also against a global average. So on this plot here, we have the global average plotted with a dotted line. So we can see clearly that the highest per ton impact are occurring in India and the US. And then actually in both of these countries, the impact is above the global average. So as a company, you would want to investigate why these results are higher. Are the yields particularly low? Are the practices more intensive, or is the biodiversity more important? Next slide. So now I'm going to dive into the real case studies using real data. And first up, we have KERING, which is a global luxury fashion house, represents a number of very well-known brands. KERING have been doing a lot of work on biodiversity in their supply chains. They've pioneered the environmental profit and loss approach, and they've recently published their own biodiversity strategy. Next slide. So I'm just going to show how we've the kind of nitty-gritty detail of how we've taken KERING data and run that through the biodiversity impact metric. So first up, we have cotton. And here we have the biodiversity impact metric equation showing where KERING have been able to provide information. So that's the text in blue versus where we have input coefficients from elsewhere. So KERING was able to provide us with an estimate of the land area directly, They had information about the production practices, and they were able to trace their supply back to the source country. Next slide. And here are some of the results. So this time shown as the impact per tonne, which allows us again to compare across sourcing locations and against the global average. So you can quickly start to see where sourcing impact is greater than the global average, and so might be considered higher risk. Next slide. And so these two maps compare the impact per tonne with the total impact on the right. So that's the total across all the tonnes that KERING are sourcing. So whilst the impact per tonne is greatest in India, when you consider the total amount the company is sourcing, their footprints in the US, Turkey, and India are similar. And this might affect how a company uses this information. So it may consider that it's a greater priority to operate in those areas where it has the kind of greatest total exposure in terms of land footprint. Next slide. So a second example was taking a different commodity for KERING, and this was using cashmere, which of course is a slightly different type of product. It's coming from goats, for example, so it's not a crop that we're growing. So we don't have quite the same data sets to draw on. But KERING is able to provide a good amount of information, particularly their estimate of land area that's needed for the cashmere that they're sourcing. And again, they also have information on production practices and the source country. Next slide. So these two plots again show the results for cashmere on the impact per tonne on the left, and then their total impact on the right. And actually you can see there's not much difference between these two things. So it might not make that much difference in how KERING uses this information. Next slide. So just to talk quickly about some other work that we're piloting, because with KERING, we've also applied the biodiversity impact metric to other livestock products such as leather. But with these, we still have some work to do because they're not quite as straightforward as some of the agricultural crops, typical agricultural crops. So for example, with leather, it's often considered a byproduct of the meat industry. And so how much of a footprint of each animal is a fashion company responsible for if it's just using the leather and not the meat? So that's a kind of an assumption and a decision that you would have to make as part of your analysis. The other side of this is externalities. So when we compare intensively raised animals, like those that are perhaps raised indoors, with extensive, so those are that kind of low density grazing, using our metric, the intense production systems often come out with better scores because they have a smaller land footprint. But in these cases, it's also really important to account for other differences, such as feedstock used for intensive animals. And we can do this with the biodiversity impact metric, but we need to make assumptions about the type of feedstock, how much the animals are eating and where it comes from, unless a company has this information to hand. Next slide. So just to highlight that the biodiversity impact metric is just one component mentioned in KERING's biodiversity strategy. And if you want to see how a company is measuring biodiversity and taking it and integrating it into a business, I really recommend you going and having a look at the strategy, which is published on their website. Next slide. So the second example I'm going to talk through briefly is ASDA, and ASDA is one of the major UK supermarkets that sources directly a large amount of fresh produce. Next slide. So first up, we looked at their cocoa sourcing. Now, ASDA didn't have any detailed information in this instance beyond the basic of the country that the cocoa was coming from and the amount that they were sourcing from each country. So in this instance, we're just using tool defaults. And as you can see from this graph, the impact per hectare was higher in Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. And when you look at what components of the metric are driving these results, we can see this is partly driven by low yields, but also by high biodiversity in Liberia. So as a company, given that we're using tool default information, the priority might be for the company to get more information on its sourcing in these higher risk regions to help sense check these results. So it may be that the farmers that they're sourcing from have much better yields than the country average, for example. Next slide. So again, just comparing the impact per tonne versus the total sourcing footprint gives you different perspectives. So whilst we know that the per tonne impact was highest in Liberia, actually because a lot of their sourcing is from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, that is where the company is potentially has a higher level of exposure. Next slide. And finally, we looked at table grapes. So ASDA has more precise information for this commodity, which allowed us to identify subnational sourcing areas. They source from a number of different countries to ensure that they have a year-round supply. But in general, you can see that the per tonne impacts were highest in Morocco and Spain, and in both these countries, it was above the global average. Next. However, comparing the per tonne impact with the total impact, again, while Spain remains one of the top countries, we also have South Africa because of the amount that they're sourcing from there. Next slide. So I think the critical question is, what do companies do with this information? And I think that with this level of granularity, you have to be a little bit cautious about the decisions that you take. So where we see the biodiversity impact metric sitting is kind of on that first step that a company needs to take to start to understand its impacts. And ideally, the biodiversity impact metric would then be integrated into a hierarchy of measurement approaches. So the better the visibility of your supply chain, the more precisely you can understand your potential impacts. And what the biodiversity impact metric can do is help to signpost where you really need to do a deeper dive on biodiversity. Next slide. So for example, it may be that you have subnational data on your sourcing. So the first thing you might do is run the biodiversity impact metric and then get an idea of where those high risk regions are. And then within those regions, you might start to look for alternative data sources that can give you a little bit more information. So things like the IBAT data, which can provide you with information like species lists, presence of protected areas and key biodiversity areas. And you might use this information to then update your risk profile of your sourcing. So you might also use this to start prioritize areas for traceability and the collection of more precise supplier data. So perhaps when you've found those areas that are of highest risk from biodiversity loss, that's where you really start to drill down and start to demand more precise information from your suppliers on the practices that they're undertaking. You might even want to start identifying areas for kind of collecting data directly on the ground. And it's in combination, all these different approaches that you can really create targets, identify actions, and define an approach to monitoring and evaluation. Next. So just to summarize, the biodiversity impact metric is most useful for risk mapping. So looking at things like, is my company at greater risk of having an impact in some regions compared to others? Are particular materials likely to have a greater impact? Where might I need to improve my traceability or visibility of my suppliers? Where can I start to think about prioritizing interventions like certification or working with farmers? Can I risk assess future suppliers using this tool? And finally, where do I just need to get more granular biodiversity data? Next. So just a quick acknowledgement of the many partners that have contributed to the development of the biodiversity impact metric, including our natural capital impact group members, of particular KERING, IBAT for their data, and the biodiversity consultancy, who I think you're going to be hearing from soon. Next slide. And finally, if you'd like more information, we have these publications on our website, so please do go and download those if you want some more details. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Cath, and congratulations for keeping so nicely within the time. I think it's almost exactly 20 minutes, so that's perfectly done. I think it was also a very clear explanation of the methodology and both case studies. It's very interesting to hear about some specific challenges you are facing, for instance, on the allocation method, and then the comparison between intensive and extensive rearing of livestock. And most of all, I think what is very promising is that you say yourself that the biodiversity impact metric has its place within a hierarchy of different biodiversity measurement approaches, and this is something that we also really want to promote. So thanks again. I can imagine that there will be quite some questions maybe on this presentation, so that's again another call to the participants. Please write down your questions in the chat box, also with your name, and we will try to deal with them after the 3 presentations. So thanks again, Cath. And now I hand over to Wilbert van Rooij of Plans Up, who will give us a presentation on the biodiversity footprint methodology and calculator. Wilbert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Johan. I hope I can be as quick as Katie. So my talk is about the biodiversity footprint methodology. It's stated calculator here, but in fact it's more about the biodiversity methodology, since the calculator is just a practical tool. Next slide, please. The footprint approach is developed on the platform of biodiversity ecosystems and economy. And we applied it for several companies, including the dairy sector. So the methodology was based on the GloBio methodology. That's from the PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. And that GloBio model is internationally implemented at various scales for various reports, the GBO, and etc., etc. So the biodiversity footprint is just taking part of it. Next slide, please. To include you first, what is GloBio about? I'm just going quickly over it. It uses different pressures to estimate the impact on biodiversity. So you do not have to measure biodiversity itself, but you measure pressures, and then you get some information about how much biodiversity is left. Well, here you can see the pressures that are involved: land use, human encroachment, infrastructure, etc. And the indicator used is called mean species abundance of the species relative to the abundance in undisturbed ecosystems, or MSA. Well, you can forget about that definition. Just remember intactness or naturalness, because that's where it's all about. And for each of these pressures types, there is a kind of a relation between the cause effect. So the higher the intensity, the higher the impact on biodiversity. So if you have a land use which is very intensive use of land, of course the biodiversity is low. If you're very close to a road, then the intensity is high, and if you go away further from the road, it's lower. We have similar relations found for fragmentation, nitrogen, and climate. So this kind of relations, the cause-effect relations, do not have to be calculated again. This is already known. So, and this is being used as a kind of a standard definition for all kinds of types of land use, for instance. And Katie already mentioned it, and they were focusing on one pressure. And as you can see, GloBio focuses on more multiple pressures. Next slide, please. So in fact, the global footprint methodology is using the cause-effect relations. So the GloBio method is an overall global method, and I actually was personally involved in downscaling it to a national level or provincial level, and I applied it in many countries in the world. But it looks to the different pressures, but not to the source of the contributors. So if you're a company, you're just part of the contribution of the impact. So the GloBio 3 method doesn't look into that. But the biodiversity footprint method does, and it takes the most the relevant factors, the most important factors, and that's land use, greenhouse gas emissions, and nitrogen, phosphor emissions to water, and water extractions. So there are a few pressures from GloBio 3 from the terrestrial model, one pressure from the aquatic GloBio model, And we tried also to develop a new pressure water extraction. So these 4 pressures are the most relevant, as I said. And in fact, food, agriculture and wood are responsible for more than 50% of the impact. And so land use is the most important factor there. And chemicals and energy, metal and plastic, it's about 32% of the impact globally, but these are related to global greenhouse gases. So you can imagine that those two, land use and greenhouse gases, you focus really on the most important pressures. So I would recommend, if you're looking into it, go first to look there and then look at other pressures. Toxicity might sound very relevant and to natural capital, for instance, but we are talking now only about biodiversity, and then toxicity is often a little bit less important than the other factors. But it's of course very important for human health. And then the biodiversity footprint calculator, it looks also to the biodiversity footprint method, but only takes the most two important pressures, land use and greenhouse gases. And it only looks to the parts of the chain which are most important, which is often the raw materials and the production, and we added the transport. So the calculator is just a practical web tool that everybody can look into. It's open source, so everybody can use it. Next slide. So we did, for the government of Netherlands, we did 8 case studies in collaboration with different companies. So Deso Carpets, DSM, Foreco, which is timber related and on sustainable produced timber and made it in such a way that it's less impactful. Moyi Coffee, natural plastics, which make plastics from different products, rest products from potato factories, for instance. Better Future Factory, they recycle all kinds of plastic for pet products. Tony Chocoloni, well known for its chocolate and looking at social welfare of the people and slave-free, as it started all with. Schut Paper, they try less residue from trees, but using residues from tomato production, which is normally thrown away. And we looked also at the sector of the Netherlands. So for each of these, we try to calculate the current footprint in biodiversity, but also the future footprint in terms of, okay, what kind of measures are people thinking of taking in the future? And for the milk sector, we made a scenario ourselves. Next slide, please. So what type of data do you need? Well, the greenhouse gas information, you need information, and you need information on land use, and particular from the raw materials. And then that for a calculator, you only need those two. And if you want to do the full method, then you also need information on water and nitrogen and phosphor to water, the impact of that. Next slide, please. So the common indicator that is used is MSA per hectare. So it's measured per pressure for an entire product chain. For land use, you can say that's the sum of the hectares of land use times the going backwards of the so the MSA, which is affected. You distract that, and then you get the MSA hectares, the impacted area. Sorry. From the emission to air, you calculate all the emissions in CO2 equivalents. And we calculate with the help of GloBio, we calculated, okay, how much of 1 kilo CO2, how much in temperature increase will that involve? And then based on the temperature increase and all kind of climate envelopes, we come up with, or the PBL came up with a temperature increase for 100 years, and then 3.29 times 10 to the minus fifth MSA per hectare. So for each kilogram of CO2, there is a kind of an impact of MSA. When you add these, and that's a good thing, this indicator, you can actually add the factors for each pressure together. And when you add these two, then you come to the total terrestrial footprint. Then the emission to water, then you have to distinguish between point and diffuse emissions. And so you can distinguish, for instance, for agriculture, you look a little bit more to the impacts on the grass and emitting to the streams, but you also can have a point emission. And then you get an emission, which is MSA not per hectare, but per cubic meter. And for this reason, I would never recommend to combine the both, but I would keep them separate. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example, here's an original ecosystem. GloBio compares the situation to the not impacted area. So if you have a farm area, the original system would be like maybe in the Netherlands forests. And then given on the cause-effect relations, we know that certain land use has certain biodiversity levels. So that's just a table. So if you have a farm which is having 50 hectares of regular management pasture, and he wants to convert it into organic management, then you can actually calculate what the impact is for the farm by summarizing the impact of the different types of land use. And then underneath you can see how the calculation is being done. Next slide, please. So here you can see the impact of climate change. So it's going through the whole supply chain, which is related to CO2 emissions, the equivalents I was talking about. Then for each of this, we know that the CO2 is causing the greenhouse effect. Then for different kinds of species, it's already calculated what in temperature increase would do. And from that relation, we calculated the general impact for 1 ton of CO2 on the MSA per hectare. And next slide, please. Also for water emission, for the impact to water, we looked at the most important factors, at least in Europe, and that's nitrogen and phosphor emission. It provides or it gives eutrophication of the water in the water, and then when it's above a certain threshold, you get impact. So for each of these, a relation with MSA was being calculated, and for different biomes. So for shallow lakes, deep lakes, and some other factors. Next slide, please. So the main goals for the companies was, okay, can we have some insight in the main pressure factors? What is actually the most important factor? So if we are going to save some money or spend some money to do something about it, where should we put in our money? What is the effectiveness of assumed biodiversity-friendly measures? And I think this is also a strength of this methodology, is that it doesn't relate to general land use by a kind of industry which is doing the same. No, it looks to what your measure is, and then it directly calculates the impact that your measure has. So you can determine the footprint difference between different products, between current and maybe a future situation. And you can see also what impact would have if you change the source of the raw materials, or if you change energy consumption into more green consumption of energy, transport systems, etc. Next, please. Here is some outcome of the dairy sector calculations. So you see in the left a scale of the footprint. The left with the yellow part, that's a regular dairy farm. Then on the right part, you see an organic farm, and to many people's surprise is that an organic farm has a little bit bigger footprint. And the main reason is that more hectarage is needed for the same production. But if you take a kind of intermediate farm type that does take measures for more biodiversity friendly, more distance to the streams, all kinds of measures are possible, but they need to have some nitrogen used to get higher production. So in that case, you can actually achieve higher or lower biodiversity footprint. So you can see that on the right as well, the difference in footprint. But on the biodiversity on the water, the footprint on the water, of course, is for a biological organic farm much lower. Next slide, please. For desert carpets, you can also see that they had some measures in their minds, and that has quite an impact, different impact. And then we found also that if you use wool from land, which is utilized quite efficiently, then you can achieve even more improvements in your footprint. So and emissions to water also the measures had quite some impact. So they were quite happy to see that how it would, but they were quite surprised actually to find that wool is so playing such a big role in a firm that uses only wool for small parts of its carpets. I'll come back to it to the reasons later. Next slide, please. Here you have Tony Chocoloni. Here you can see that a difference we calculated for different farms, and we knew the source, but you can see that the low productive farms have a relatively high impact, and you can see down which parts of the production and which parts of the have which kind of impact. So you can see that the highest impact is really the cocoa production, not so much the sugar or the process and etc. And if you use it from high productive farms, the most efficient way to achieve a lower footprint, while at the same time you can do something also about the social welfare of the people. Next, please. For Foreco, they had wood from different sources, and they said, okay, if we take wood from maybe a sustainable forest management in Germany, or we take it all the way from New Zealand. And to their surprise, actually the wood from the New Zealand had a smaller footprint, even with transport and everything involved, than the footprint of the sustainable managed forest. However, they didn't take into consideration the economic allocation of different multiple use of that forest. And since the New Zealand and Australian forest plantations are just agricultural crops, 100% use of only crops, the trees in South Germany had many natural values, recreational, hunting, etc. If you take that into consideration with economic allocation, then of course the footprint becomes lower, but those factors were still missing. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so problems with the slides, I think. Coming. Okay, general conclusions for the companies. So first of all, the footprint, they helped them to give insight which practices and processes had the largest contribution. That was quite positive about. It gives a localization that was considered as being very important. Where is it actually having impact? Between the current and future alternative situation, and also the effectiveness of their own measures. So overall, it was concluded that especially for organic materials, this way was quite positive. Next slide, please. So the companies had some other conclusions, and like I said, Desso was surprised why the wool had such a big impact. And the mainly reason was that it needs a lot of land, which came. And later they were thinking of using land from Norway, which is less intensively used. Foreco also for their intensive managed forests, and so there's many other examples. And Mailly Coffee, to give one more, is that the coffee by air had a relatively low impact on biodiversity and not by sea, but that was also because the impact of the land use intensity was far more important for biodiversity than the relatively small impact on biodiversity. Of course, on carbon, it is very important. Next slide, please. So challenges to get information for the raw materials, but I think it's like CO2, if you buy products, the company can just say, okay, I need to know where it's coming from and what is the type of management. If you do that, there's no problem. But also a question like, what can we do with oil? I mean, that's over with carpets, and uses a lot of oil, but what is the impact on biodiversity? That's not easy. So you have to do some kind of risk calculation. The products from extensive management systems, and what was Katie calling again, we had some solution by using the proportional use of biomass. So if sheep or cattle is using only proportion of the biomass, only proportion is being held responsible for the footprint. So economic use, when you use multiple use, of course, that's very important to take all those uses in consideration to calculate your part of the footprint. And then the credibility of ISO certification is very important, and that's not done yet for this, but maybe there will be an institute who can do this. Next slide, please. So the calculated web tool is just, like I said, it's available on the website. It focuses just on 2 pressure types and the most important supply chain parts. Next slide, please. So you can see this is the layout. If you go on the website, you can just fill in the information. It also says where to get your information from, how to calculate it, and then you can calculate it. Next slide, please. And then you can get results for a current scenario and for if you take some measures. So if you want to calculate different measures, it automatically calculates the difference in impact. So you can see where if you spend some money on certain measures, what kind of improvements you have. And this whole tool was made by students from Saxion in a few weeks' time, because there was no budget for it. I did it just by my own initiative. But I think this is a very easy tool, and if somebody is willing to actually make it a more professional tool out of it, I think it's possible. I think I'm just on time. That was my presentation.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Yes, you did.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah, you did very well in terms of timing, and also the presentation was very good, I think, even with the plenty of case studies that you wanted to present, you stayed within your time slot very well. Again, to the participants, I would ask, so if people have questions, please put them in the chat box. As for the moment, I don't see many questions popping up. But I have already a number of questions, so we can start with that if necessary. Okay, thank you, Wilbert. Now we go to the last presenter of today, which is Malcolm Starkey of the Biodiversity Consultancy. And Malcolm will introduce us a little bit in some basic principles on approaches to understanding biodiversity in supply chains, and also how to pick the right metric and what are the pros and cons of different metrics for biodiversity measurement. And he will also illustrate that with a short case study. Malcolm, over to you.
Thank you very much, Johan, and thank you very much to Cath and to Wilbert for those fascinating case studies. And it's great to see how these footprinting approaches can create surprises for companies and help them understand where their impacts are coming from. So yes, my name is Malcolm Starkey. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at the Biodiversity Consultancy. We're a small company based in Cambridge, and we work with companies of a range of sizes who want to do better for biodiversity in very different ways. And as Johan says, I'm going to try and take a different approach and look at more of the big picture before coming down to a very short case study. Can we have next slide, please? So yeah, just so we know where we're starting from. Supply chain impacts are essential for meeting global goals to nature. There's increasing recognition that they are often bigger than companies' direct footprints, and that's being reflected in many existing initiatives and new ones that are being developed, whether that's national laws or biodiversity action plans or processes like the science-based targets for nature. Next slide, please. And at the same time, and probably the two are related, we're also living in a time where there's a huge variety of new data, metrics, and tools that are available. So, we've heard about 2 different tools just now, but there's others: the Global Biodiversity Score, Impact World Plus, LC Impact, BII, BFFI, so many different things that, as Johan presented at the beginning, people have started to need to classify them and understand how they all fit together. And you've got an example there of a recent sort of compass that for navigating this complexity that IUCN put together. And then you have many new data sets. So at the top there, you've got the range rarity layer that Cath mentioned. The next one down is the global layer of potential natural and modified habitat from WCMC, which came out just a couple of months ago. And the one at the bottom is a forest condition index, which again, it's available for the whole world freely, and came out in the last couple of months. Just it's a huge amount of new data that's available that wasn't there 5 or 10 years ago. So what I want to talk about is a little bit of how we make sense of this, and how when a company comes to us, they may have heard of a particular metric and they say, can we use this? We want to do this. How we actually then talk through whether that's appropriate and work out what's best for their needs. Next slide, please. So the first question is always, what do you actually want to do? Because the type of data and metric you use depends very much on what you want to use it for. If you're at an early stage of a biodiversity journey and you just want to identify which bits of the supply chain may have the highest risks, you can probably get away with using data which is less precise and more generic. On the other hand, if you're ready to be setting science-based targets, you may want to do something a bit more comprehensive and more detailed with particular metrics. So that's very much the first thing to understand. Next slide, please. It's also important to clarify the terminology. There's often quite a bit of confusion. People come and say, can I use MSA? And they think it's a tool, but actually really it's a metric. So just to start from first principles, the metric is the bit at the center, which is basically it's a mathematical representation of reality. That's really what it is. A metric on its own is of no use. You need to feed it with data. So that would be measured or modeled information. So an example, like from the last presentation, would be GlobIO, but there are others, sources of land cover maps and so on. And then there are tools which package maybe one or more sources of information and of data and one or more metrics. So global biodiversity score would be an example, or just as Wilbert just presented just now, his calculator is an example of a tool that packages the GlobIO model and some associated data with a metric called MSA. And then you have more broadly frameworks which provide sort of criteria and guidance for how to choose a metric without necessarily prescribing one or another. So examples may be the broad version of the Biodiversity Impact Metric that Cath referred to, or the Science-Based Target for Nature Guidance, which talks about which types of metric you may want to explore in different situations. Next slide, please. So, once you're clear about that, the next thing is to recognize that at each of these stages, every metric, every set of data, every model, every tool has to make some assumptions, because biodiversity is complex, especially when we're looking at a global scale, as we often are with supply chains. And so you cannot measure everything. So you have to make some trade-offs. And 3 of the sort of core dimensions of that are sort of the validity of the data. So, is it an accurate measure of the right things, how precise it is, how complete it is, how many aspects of biodiversity it takes into account, and then of course how feasible it is. Can you actually get it done in the right amount of time and for the right cost? So it's very much like when you're buying a secondhand car. You want a car that's fast and cheap and reliable, but really you have to pick 2. You can never get all 3 at once, and it's very much the same with a biodiversity metric. So once you understand that all metrics are making assumptions, and there's always going to be a trade-off, you can start to think, okay, what are these assumptions and are they appropriate for what I want to do? Next slide, please. So, the key questions about a metric or a tool is, first of all, how is it representing biodiversity and the impacts on it? Is it a metric that looks at the individual trees, or is it a big picture metric that looks at the forest? And does it just look at one type of impact, land use change, or does it also include things, impacts on particular species, so collision risk or mortality? And then, will the information that the metric gives me, will it be sufficiently granular and precise for what I want to do with it? And then to start to answer those questions, it's useful to put a bit of structure to understand the different aspects of a metric. Next slide, please. And so a very useful framework is the same one that's used by the Biodiversity Impact Metric that Cath mentioned, which is to look at extent, condition, and significance. It's a framework which looks at it underpins, for example, national biodiversity metrics in the UK or in Australia. It is used in systematic conservation planning. And so you can think for each of those, what is this metric telling me and what are the elements it includes? So for extent, you can say, what is the coverage? Is it looking at just freshwater or just terrestrial, or does it do terrestrial and freshwater and marine? Spatial resolution, does it give me a result that's accurate to the nearest country or the nearest continent? What level of information does it give me, and how precise is it? For condition, which bits of biodiversity is it looking at? Is it looking at just at species abundance, or maybe is it also looking at ecosystem function and structure? As in the previous example, which pressures is it looking at? Is it just looking at land use, or do you also include nitrogen and other forms of pollution? And then how granular is it? Can it tell the difference between sourcing from a certified forest and a non-certified forest, for example? And then significance, as biodiversity varies so much around the world, how are we measuring that? What are the different components of that? Are we looking in terms of distinctiveness, just at species richness, or also rarity, also threat status? Does it consider the landscape context? Are we looking at the landscape integrity and intactness? And then, very importantly, does it take into account stakeholder concerns? Because biodiversity is local, and those concerns may vary very significantly. So that provides sort of framework for thinking about a metric. Next slide, please. So as an example, a very simplified one, here's a comparison of 3 metrics using just the land use component to keep it simple. So you've got 2 metrics called the potentially disappeared fraction with associated tools, and then the biodiversity impact metric in its sort of default formulation. So the first 2, in terms of the extent of an impact, is very much based on your input data. They'll go to the scale of the data that you have, but they don't necessarily help you along the way. They don't hinder you either. The biodiversity impact metric, it provides some information on average country crop yields. So if you know which crop and which country, it takes you already part of the way. It's already packaged up some of that information. For condition, the first is looking at local species loss, which may be reversible, and it's got 5 combinations of land use and intensity. The second is looking at a different aspect of species loss, where it's regional or global, so basically irreversible species lost, with a few more combinations of land use and intensity. But you can see already that although the metric has the same name, the approach is quite different. It's giving you quite different information. And then, as we've heard before, the biodiversity impact metric uses species abundance and has about 15 different combinations of land use and intensity. And then for significance, the first PDF, it doesn't weight between the by significance at all. Essentially, it does between the realms, terrestrial, freshwater, marine, but basically if you're on land, it's assuming that somewhere in Africa it's exactly the same as somewhere in Latin America. So if that's an assumption that is fine for your intended use, that's perfectly fine. If that is not, then maybe you need to look at something else. So the other PDF looks at uses weighting by species richness, endemism, and threat, and it provides that information at the scale of an ecoregion. So it doesn't tell you anything about the difference between 2 points in an ecoregion, but it will tell you the difference between the 2 ecoregions. And BIM is similar, but it goes to a scale within the country portion of an ecoregion. So it's a slightly finer scale. So none of them is right, none of them is wrong. They're just all making different assumptions. And it's important to understand those, to understand whether a particular metric is suitable for what you want to do with it. So I'll give a short example. Next slide, please. So this was a consumer goods company who were seeking to develop biodiversity targets in alignment with global goals. They already had existing targets on carbon and detailed metrics and control measures for some impacts, like ecotoxicity. So that they sort of felt was already covered. It was a large number of individual ingredients, but they could be traced back to a smaller number of mostly plant-based sources. And they actually had quite a high level of resolution on source location and production practices. So we felt, after looking at this and discussing it with them, that using a land occupancy approach, and we used the BIM framework with a few adaptations as being the most appropriate, because it captured the largest source of impacts, which was the land use, and it provided information that was clearly additional to the existing data. So, in addition to what they already had on carbon and what they already had on ecotoxicity, for example. So, next slide, please. So, a summary of some of the results. So, on the left, you have the unweighted land occupancy from the principal crops that were producing the ingredients, and you see oil palm made up the bulk of that. On the right, you see the difference with the weighting by biodiversity significance, in this case using range rarity. And this was useful for the company in two ways. I mean, first, they knew that oil palm was a big part of their impact and was a risk, but they hadn't really seen that it was like really the majority of it. The second was coconut. They hadn't really considered that that was a significant part of their impacts. And when it was weighted by the biodiversity significance, it was the second most important impact. And when we added contextual data to this, and you say, well, actually, coconut is a crop for which there is not yet a widely accepted certification scheme, that was useful information for them about where to prioritize their investment and the further work. And then equally, they hadn't really considered that some of the crops that were being sourced mostly from Europe had any kind of particular significance. But in fact, the volumes were so large that of the products that they were sourcing from things like oilseed rape actually meant that they became quite an important part of the overall footprint. And so that again was useful to them. So it helped them justify their existing focus on palm, but it added some new things that they also wanted to focus on. And this is just, this was very much the beginning of a journey. I think, as Cath said early on, this was, understanding your risks and working out where to prioritize action. And because of the way the metric worked and the way it was set up, we were also able to present these results by individual ingredient, by geography, by business unit, and even you could make approximations for individual products. So because of the purchasing manager doesn't go out and buy oil palm, they're buying a product which is derived from oil palm, and so it's not particularly useful for them to know that this much of our impact is from oil palm. The more important thing is to know, well, these three products have big impacts from oil palm, and so let's start thinking about how we can reduce those impacts. A second brief case study, next slide, please. And this is just to emphasize that footprinting and quantitative assessment is not necessarily always the most appropriate for a company. This is a company that was sourcing from a number of municipalities in Brazil and wanted to understand the relative risk, again, to focus their efforts for the next step of work. And so you can put together some of these global data sets. So you can look at the rate of tree cover loss. You can look at range rarity as a measure of biodiversity significance, but you can also look at the intactness of the ecosystem, because just because an area has rare species, that doesn't capture the whole story. And then you can put those together into an overall risk rating. So in this example, you can see that the areas that came out as high risk were the areas where there was high deforestation, and highest risk was where there was a high level of range rarity, and then either very high intactness, so any marginal impact is starting to destroy that intactness, or low levels of intactness, where basically every remaining hectare of natural forest is very important. And so you have, for intactness, you sort of have a U-shaped function to your significance. But you can present that in a simple way with a categorical ranking. And that information is often at the start of a company's journey, really, really important. You don't necessarily need to go further than that. So I've been talking quite fast, but that's a summary of two examples. Can you next slide, please? So the overview is, it's now feasible to assess the biodiversity impacts and opportunities of supply chains at big scales and at a resolution sufficient to inform decision making. And I think that would be a conclusion from both the two previous case studies as well. It's important to recognize that all biodiversity metrics are a simplification of reality, but even imperfect metrics can be used to drive positive change if they're used with the right care. So if you understand the assumptions that the metric is making, and therefore you can interpret the results and identify the appropriate actions. And when you're choosing a metric, two of the key things to think about are, how is it representing biodiversity, and is it capturing the bits of the elements of biodiversity that are important for what I want to use this for, and is it sufficiently granular for its intended use? And you always need to contextualize the results to understand the implications, because with all global data sets make some assumptions, and if you're extrapolating to a global layer, there will always be some local areas where the model data, the extrapolation, doesn't actually fit with reality. So you always need to triangulate and understand with the context. Next slide, please. So there you go. Thank you very much. And I think I stuck to time by talking very fast.
Thank you, Malcolm. Yes, indeed. We won again a few minutes, but it's almost exactly 20 minutes. So thanks a lot. Also for this helicopter view, let's say, of different approaches and some basic principles that you should take into account when starting with the exploration of potential measurement of biodiversity risks in supply chains. Now we have the time for a discussion, a Q&A with the different presenters. I would say, please take this opportunity because you have some real experts together now in the room. I must say, at this moment, I don't see specific questions in the chat box, unless I am wrong. Janne, can you confirm that?
Hi, Johan.
Yeah.
I'm seeing various questions, so if you want, I can just address them to the speakers, or
Yes.
can you see them?
It's
if you
strange,
click
but...
on show conversation.
Yeah, I see many questions to me, but also to the others. So.
Okay, I will try to find it. Janne, maybe you can start with some questions.
Johan, I've sent you all the questions in your mailbox for
okay,
thank you. I noted you hadn't seen them.
So maybe to fill the time, Johan has found the questions. There is a question for Cath. So Cath, where do you get the world average, for example, for grapes and cacao?
Yeah, so all of this information draws on the FAO Stat database. So that if you've never come across this, it's an amazing database compiled by FAO, which has global estimates of production and yields for just about every crop imaginable over a wide range of years as well. So that's where we draw data from in order to create average impact scores.
There was a question from P.A. Duvernois from MAOBI. Also for you, Cath, when you say 30% of the biodiversity is left with organic production or 10%, where do this ratio come from?
So this is a combination of the MSA values, but also some interpretation that we've done using other data sets and scientific studies. It's a little bit complicated, but there is more information if you look at the supplementary information document for our report on our website.
Yes, maybe I can click in here because I see the third question is also related to that. But how many categories of land use intensities do you have in the biodiversity impact metric, Cath?
So just 3. We have kind of light, moderate, and intense that we classify them into. And
how many categories of land use?
Well, actually, I wouldn't say off the top of my head, but Malcolm says there's 5 in his presentation. So I'm going to go with 5.
Yeah, okay. Which means, in fact, 15 different combinations of land use intensity. Okay, yeah. Thank you. There is a question. There are a few questions to Wilbert. First, Julien Callas from AFD. Do Globio 3 capture the considered second biggest pressure on biodiversity, which is direct extraction of resources?
Yeah, I think Julian rephrases it further on. But I have to know what he's meaning, because is it extraction of like mining, or is it extraction of organic resources? Because that's a big difference. If Julian is referring to organic, then Of course, using resources is like using an X number of quantity of for a product like sugar from sugar beets or whatever. And of course, that's related to how much hectares that you are going to use. So in that sense, it's related to the impact. And the intensity of the land use, of course, is also very relevant. But if you're talking about like extraction of mining, like deep pit mining, I think in general that is the impact on biodiversity is relatively low because it's only affecting a small population of life around the mining area.
Okay, and proceeding with you further, Wilbert, there's a question from Anne-Claire Asselin. You said indeed that ecotoxicity is less important for biodiversity, but well, are you sure about this statement?
Yeah, of course, it's very important for the local biodiversity. But if you talk in terms of how much toxicity is part of the impact on biodiversity in the world, that's really very small. So in that sense, it's small. Of course, it can be very high locally, but you have to see that like with land spills, that the effect of toxicity is very, very local. I mean, it's very harmful to people, to man, and maybe some animals who live around it. But if you look to the big pie of impact of biodiversity that's caused by companies, then it's not that. It's another thing when you have toxic waste in water, or like the gold mining in the Amazon and with mercury. So there are many examples. Then it has a large area and it involves a lot of impact. But with landfills, it's relatively small compared to the other ones. So in that sense, I mean it. So not for that particular area, because it can, of course, be very, very high.
Yeah, and there's another question for you, Wilbert, and of course I understand that many of these questions also relate to the basic methodology of Globio, of course. Yeah. But why didn't you include the nitrogen deposit pressure from Globio in your model? I guess what is meant here is the terrestrial deposit of nitrogen, yeah, and only the nutrients to the aquatic environment.
Yeah, well, like first of all, nitrogen deposition on land, we didn't take that into in the first methodology, because you have to find out who's contributing what kind of emission. So in nitrogen, deposition is coming from different sources. It's depending also on the winds, from which source is the wind coming, and then you have to calculate what is the impact by your product or by your company that you're trying to calculate the footprint for. And then when you know how to do that, then of course, and you know which winds they are going and in which protected and natural areas are involved, then you can do some calculation. But that's why it was a bit complicated to start with. And we thought, let's start with the two major ones. That's more important. It's similar to infrastructure. It's very relevant in some cases. But then again, who's using the roads? Is your company is just one of them. Then you have to calculate, okay, how much % of the use of the road is used by your company? And then you can say something about the impact. So.
Wilbert, I see that a lot of these questions on your methodology, in fact, go back to the fact the local context is not taken into account in your model. Eh? So you really work with only global those impact relationships. So we hear from Cath in her presentation that biodiversity is a typically local contextual issue, why you in your methodology doesn't take into account the local context. Of course, the application is different. In BIM, the application is really to identify biodiversity risks in the supply chain, localized risks, why in your model, it's more comparing different types of operating models or different types of ingredients or products. Is that correct?
No, I wouldn't agree with you, like you stated like this, because I think it's one of the few methods that actually does look into local impact. The cause-effect relations, you can actually try to adjust them, but the PBL did do they included all kind of impact relations from different areas. So, and the differences between the land use types are not that big in impact. So, but of course, when you have information on species, you could actually calculate it very locally for your own situation, but that's not where a model is about. And if you talk about like many of the models, the other models are looking to what is the industry doing if this and this happens, but they don't look at the real direct local area of where the raw materials are produced. And this model is doing that. So first of all, you look into the land use intensity of that particular area, and then the land use intensity for that relation, you take a generic relation from the cause-effect relations from GloBio. So in that sense, you rely on generic information, but you apply it very locally in specific location. If you don't do that, if you do not go to the source and where it's actually coming from, then I think you throw everything on one pile, and you take very generic assumptions, which can be very, very different, as land use can be managed very different. So all these kind of measures can be taken into consideration. But if there's other more information on like what kind of species abundance is there locally, of course you can use that as well, but it makes it very, very complex. So, and I don't know what you're talking about, how to what kind of local impact you're talking about, Johan, for instance, of other models who are doing that. Maybe you can give an example of that.
Yeah, I'm just referring to many other methodologies that, like the BIM, for instance, who also take into account, for instance, this range rarity maps. STAR relies on presence of threatened species and so on, which is all very, very contextual information. I'm only referring to that, Wilbert. Okay. But let's go, because indeed questions are coming in. I see another question on, and that's a question for both Cath and Wilbert, on the fact that the difference between intensive and more extensive agriculture seems to go in the advantage of the more intensive agriculture. Is this a right perception, or is this a misperception? This is one question.
Cath, can I try first?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Well, first, yeah, that's a good way. It's a trade-off, actually. Yeah. So when you do an intensification of production, you need less area, and the GloBio is measured in terms of extent times quality. So quality times quantity. So the biodiversity in this very small area can be very high. But if you calculate it for the entire country, then it's very insignificant. It's the same for companies. I mean, you can do something for a very small area and your biodiversity impact is low there, but you have to calculate your impact of the entire area. And in that sense, when you increase the impact of or the intensity of the production, you need less land, and that means in theory that you have less pressure on the rest of the land. So the rest of the land can be used for restoring biodiversity. So that's the whole idea behind it. So there's always a trade-off. Like in Europe now, everybody wants to go organic farming. That's very nice, but the reality is that then you have a trade-off to the tropical areas, because the same production, if the consumption doesn't change, the same production still has to be achieved. And if it's achieved by, for instance, the tropics, they even use far more important areas with more species, and they convert it into agricultural production. This is just an example to look out of the box. So that's why the intensity is quite important. Of course, the biodiversity level and the quality of the biodiversity on the particular area where you have less intensive land use is going up. That's for sure. But your footprint as a whole is going sometimes up as long as your area that you need to have the same production increases.
Yeah, good.
So yeah, I agree with what Wilbert says, although of course it's complicated, and it's why you shouldn't use footprint metrics to drive all your decisions, because there are a number of other factors that you need to consider. For example, it's if a company is going to go down the route of using intensive production in order to reduce its biodiversity footprint, it really needs to make sure that the land it's no longer using for its production, is being restored for nature. That it's not just that we have an expansion of production everywhere. So yeah, complicated. And I mean, there are lots of studies which show that land sparing, so intensifying production will save more species in a way, but there is also counter arguments that you can have highly productive food systems that also can support high levels of biodiversity. So it's not straightforward.
Yeah, thank you both.
Maybe I can jump in on that as well, just adding something. So I think this is one of the reasons why it's really important to consider landscape context. So, if you're in a landscape where there is a lot of remaining natural habitat, then, the marginal effect of losing a hectare of natural habitat may be quite small. And so, maybe moving to an extensive production method is more appropriate, because you maintain some biodiversity on your production land and still a significant area of natural habitat. If you're in a landscape where there are just tiny fragments of natural habitat remaining, each of those remains extremely valuable. And so moving to an extensive production method, which result in transformation of those, has a very significant impact. So it's really important to interpret your results in the context of the landscapes that you're operating in.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. It can even be stepping stones, and if you have biodiversity conservation measures like converting from regular farming to organic farming, if you do that near nature areas, that has far better implications for nature than if you do it in an area which is completely industrialized.
Okay. Another question is about again about your approach of the biodiversity footprint calculator. Do you also take into account packaging? And I want to combine this into a similar question. It looks very much like an LCA-based approach, isn't it? And because transport is included, production is included, do you think it can be considered as an LCA-based approach?
Not completely, because LCA uses different. They use actually the production, and then they refer to production areas with a certain type of impact, while this methodology is looking to the actual location of the impact. So this is a big difference. Yeah. Also, if you want to do a specific measure of a company and you want to say, okay, we are going to use more green energy and we are going to move this water extraction and we are going to reduce the nitrogen, all that kind of measures, it's very difficult actually to include this in an LCA, while it's quite easy to actually do it in the methodology that I was describing. But packaging is just a small aspect of the production, I think. But then, of course, you have to think of, okay, is plastic coming from? And then you come back to my remark about like using fossil fuel oil products. What kind of impact does that have? That's very complicated. I don't have an answer also about that.
Okay, I have a question for Wilbert, but I think you answered it already. Is the web tool available? Is it freely accessible? And you said yes. Can you confirm?
Yeah, it's open source. Yeah. People can steal from it, whatever.
Yeah, and what if people want to add these additional pressures?
That would be great, and I would love it. The GloBio person behind it, they always, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency and Rob Alkemaar, they're always stressing, if you want to add a pressure, be my guest, but there should be those response relations valid for different types and for instance for land use. So that's always the problem. I mean, you can add a lot of stuff, but you need to find out, okay, do we have those response relations? If so, then you can add it. That's always the problem with this kind of methodology.
Yeah, and I have the same question to Cath. So Cath, you informed us about BIM. can interested users start using it, or do they have to contact Cambridge Institute?
So it's an open source method. We've published the methodology in our report. There should be enough information for people to get started by themselves, but you do need some technical expertise to access and process some of the underlying data sets you need.
Okay. I have a question to Malcolm. Malcolm, you introduced us to a few guidelines on how to select a suitable metric, but what about a combination of metrics to have a more complete picture, which can be presented by means of a dashboard, for instance? Can you tell something about that?
Mm-hmm. Sure, absolutely. Biodiversity is multi-dimensional, and so it is often useful to consider various different dimensions of it, and that may require using different tools, or more often than not, a tool to understand the magnitude of your impact, and then you're using various different measures of significance to interpret that. So a good example would be if you look at the emerging guidance for setting targets. That's aligning very much with the draft post-2020 global goals, and so they're looking for companies to think about measuring their impact and setting targets on different elements of biodiversity. So one of the goals is about the area, integrity and connectivity of ecosystems. One of them is about species abundance, and one of them is about species extinction risk. And then there are others about nature's contribution to people. But those first three, which are very much about the underlying species biodiversity, they require different ways of measuring them. So the species abundance, MSA is an excellent way of measuring that. BIM, or an adapted version of the BIM framework, is a very good way to look at the area integrity and connectivity of ecosystems, assuming you use the right measures of significance. And then there are emerging metrics like the STAR metric, species threat abatement and restoration one, which look directly at extinction risk. So certainly it may be relevant for some companies and some users to look at those different things. The broad approach is to start with a sort of a materiality assessment to understand, what is most appropriate for a given company. So, if you're operating in just one or two landscapes where there is a particular landscape context, then maybe a landscape context metric isn't going to add very much, because you sort of already know that. On the other hand, if you're in a place where there is a high proportion of threatened species, you may want to focus on that. So it's again, it's understanding what you want to do with the metric.
Okay, thanks.
Johan, maybe just one remark.
Very short, Wilbert, because we have to close.
Keep it short, because I think it's very nice how Cathy is actually adding also the rarity. But in fact, you're talking then about valuation of a kind of biodiversity. And if you do that, then of course the number of species should be included as well, because if you destroy something where there's a high number of species involved, you destroy something which, in my opinion, is more worth than something where there's only 2 species involved. And rarity is the other one. So I think in that sense, it's very easy to actually combine this with the objective MSA, because that doesn't say anything about value.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Indeed, combination is the thing for the future, I think. And we will try with the platform. We will try to support you with that. So today, I think we can conclude. And thanks a lot for all the participants who asked questions and for the presenters. We learned about biodiversity measurement approaches in the supply chain. We learned about the parameters on which these methodologies rely. We learned about the metrics that they are using, the pros and contrasts. We learned about possibilities for combining different approaches. And this is all very helpful also for us to shape the decision framework that we are further developing to help you to choose the right biodiversity measurement approach. I just want to refer to the next sessions. I think it's the next slide. Yeah, so we have now the next webinar next week is about corporate and sector level approaches. Then we have one on approaches for the financial sector, and we had one that we had to postpone on product level approaches on the 29th of October. Thanks again to all the participants and to the presenters for the excellent presentations and the interactive discussion. And you will receive the slides and the recordings as soon as possible, and they will be available on our website. I wish you all a nice continuation of your day, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you.